You are listening to Radio Alamundi.
Hi there, wherever you are. I'm Marco Rixecker, a freelance writer, reporter, producer, teacher, translator, tour guide, poet, singer, and songwriter. I speak several languages, and I'm the creator and founder of Radio Alamundi, an evolving podcast station where no language and all languages are spoken. It's a multilingual mix of music, poetry, lectures, languages, interviews, documentaries, recipes, and a lot more, co-produced with the students of the Alamundi International Cultural Center. You can find us on radioalamundi.bandcamp.com, podcasts.apple.com, Spotify, YouTube, Breaker, Player FM, Facebook. Search Radio Alamundi. The first thing that strikes me about Shara McCallum is her voice. I should be familiar with it because I've heard her read one of her poems in a daily podcast I've subscribed to. It's one of the reasons why I decided to find out more about the author of an otherwise poignant poem. It doesn't take me too long to find Shara McCallum's personal website and read up a little more on her background and work. Eventually, I fill out an interview request form and submit it. At first, it looks like there's going to be no feedback because there's no response for several weeks. But then eventually I get an email from Shara McCallum in which she apologizes for the delay due to some technical glitches. But it's cool, there are no strings attached as far as deadlines are concerned. Right from the start of our video conversation, I feel so jealous though, because Shara is having a cup of coffee. I tell her about it, and she laughs. But it kind of makes sense. After all, it is 10 a.m. in Pennsylvania, which is where she is located, sitting in her office at Penn State University. She teaches literature and English there. Early on, she tells me about her diverse and multifaceted background, which has made it into her poetry, and which I could also sense when I listened to her poem in the podcast that motivated me to reach out and ask for this interview. The bio on her website describes Shara McCallum as a woman of Jamaican and Venezuelan descent, but that doesn't even scratch the surface of her diverse ethnic background. As a matter of fact, it reflects the frequently cruel and brutal process of cultural blending which occurred during the colonial era, especially on the Caribbean islands. As a consequence, a country like Jamaica isn't just about reggae, Rastafari and Ska. Different languages and dialects are spoken on the island, including Creole, Scots, and Patois. The latter is a little-known language which Shara grew up with and even recites 2 nursery rhymes in as part of our conversation. So our online interview goes beyond asking questions and giving answers. It frequently goes back and forth in terms of sharing stories and experiences, even a verse that came to me in a dream the night before our online talk. So, Shara McCallum happens to be a great storyteller. I mean, weaving together a tale or narrative out of a rhyme composed of 3 words in a couple of minutes is quite an accomplishment she achieved spontaneously in the course of our conversation. It sounds like a masterclass in storytelling. And Shara McCallum is a teacher indeed, so I ask her about any recommendations she might have for students. Eventually, Shara and I lose track of time and whatever later engagements we might have. And so, when the interview is coming to an end, it feels a bit like a wake-up call, like waking up out of an intense dream. Needless to say that we promise to stay in touch and meet in person whenever the possibility arises. So The following narrative includes excerpts from a collection of testimonies and interviews entitled Let's Talk About It Anywhere in the World, where it is all about people's voices, accents, and speech patterns, hand in hand with my own personal anecdotes and observations. In addition to that, people are allowed to introduce themselves in their respective, often indigenous languages and dialects, and to speak their minds freely without any paraphrases or expectations. So let the story go on from there. One of the coolest podcasts out there is Poem a Day by the Academy of American Poets. As its title suggests, it is a daily podcast, mostly featuring a poem read by a narrator or by the author. And that is how I hear Shara McCallum's voice for the first time. There is deliberate depth and melody in it, and it breathes life into a poem that tells a story about relationships and memories. And it is a privilege to hear it speak to me directly online on a gray November morning. Shara McCallum is sitting in her office at the University of Pennsylvania, where the leaves have started to change colors, and she can enjoy their intensity through the window behind her, while she is facing me during our conversation.
So, hi everyone. My name is Shara McCallum. I am a poet and an essayist, a teacher as well. And I am right now at Penn State University, which is in State College, Pennsylvania. It is 10:07 Eastern Daylight Time, and I'm really delighted to be with all of you, even if just through voice. And thank you for having me.
What's the weather like over there right now?
Well, it is the fall. And so that means that today is quite gray, rainy. It's about maybe 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's cool, but it is not as cold as it's going to get here. It will get quite a bit colder as the winter comes on, and it will get grayer as it comes on as well. But right now it's kind of a lovely fall day, moderate temperatures.
If you looked out your window right now, what would you see?
Well, trees, which is what I love about the office it's otherwise a quite business-like office, but I add some pillows, as you can see in the back, and I have the nice expansive trees through that window, and some light, comes in through the window, but trees, principally maples, oaks. The two that I'm seeing proximate or in the distance, one looks like a maple to me. You can't see that, I don't think. It's a bit further in from where you're sitting, but it is really red right now. And generally, when those leaves turn scarlet this time of year, I'm not close enough to just, look at the shape of the leaf, but the color is suggesting to me that it's a maple tree.
What is your favorite season?
Oh, well, I'm originally from Jamaica, so I have to say that I am tipped in the direction, living outside of it in the Northeast for the majority, the balance of my life, actually. I'm tipped in the direction of summer first. And I think that's because I don't particularly love being very cold. I don't mind the weather right now. If this was as cold as it ever got, I'd be fine with that. It's nice to put on a sweater, and so I think autumn actually is my second favorite season in this part of the world. But summer still for me is nothing beats listening to crickets and being able to sit outside in the coming dusk or watching, fireflies in the grass. I really love summer, and also just not having to put on a lot of extra clothes to be outside. I love it. But autumn is an amazing season as well, which I never experienced growing up. After I moved from Jamaica, I moved to Miami. So of course, we have change of seasons in the tropics. It's not that anywhere doesn't have it, but it's more marked by the rainy season, the coming, of the very wet hurricane threat season. And then we have what's our drier season when we're outside of the wet season and the hurricanes are less threatening. And that's when we have cooler weather. So people might, because of the way in which the Northern Hemisphere exports so much of its images to us, people might call it fall or winter, but the truth is our seasons are different in the tropics. Whereas here, it's really demarcated by 4 seasons. And I really love the autumn here. Close second, I'd say. And Keats's poem to autumn is a beautiful ode to the season.
Our interview takes place in the morning, when everything is still cool and fresh in the fall, and we're both enjoying a cup of coffee at our respective locations. It gives our encounter a sensation of profound serenity, which I can also hear in Shara McCallum's voice. She's a college professor and teaches literature and poetry at Penn State. One of the first things I do is tie in the visual surroundings to a video chat that is supposed to become an audio podcast or documentary. And so, the scenery of a college campus in Pennsylvania makes it into our discussion, which quickly moves from the intensity of the colors of the fall and summer as her favorite season, especially in Jamaica, her home country, to poetry and literature. What is your cultural heritage?
Well, I'm born in Jamaica. My father is a mixed race, Black Jamaican. His father is Jamaican, and his mother is British from the UK, from England. And on my mother's side, my mother is Venezuelan. She was born in Caracas, and her father was Venezuelan, and her mother was also Trinidadian by where she was raised, but British by birth. She was adopted as a baby by a Trinidadian mother and a British father living in Trinidad at that time. This makes sense if you remember that all of, not of course Venezuela, but both Trinidad and Jamaica at the time when my grandparents were born and growing up. When my mother was born, even though she's born in Caracas, she moves from Venezuela to Jamaica as a child, is a colony still of the British Empire. So I'm born in 1972, and Jamaica as an independent nation is 10 years old when I'm born. So just to give some perspective, those are the countries of my grandparents that I immediately hail from. Racially, ethnically, I am, a mixture of peoples. I very strongly identify as Black and also of Hispanic origins. But many people, when they meet me, are surprised by this. I'm very fair. And so, what makes you who you are is a product of, I think, ancestry, memory, cultural connections, as much as just DNA. My sisters are interested, I have a lot of sisters. 2 of them are interested in, like many people, doing these DNA tests. So I have a good sense of our family, and we have over 25 countries represented. So we are quite, I guess the truest way to say it is my peoples have migrated, sometimes by force, honestly, and sometimes somewhat by choice, if you can think of having limited choices as choice. Generally, that seems to be the path that my family has taken.
So, Shara McCallum originally comes from Jamaica. She is quite interested in topics like democracy and diversity, which is why she always likes to introduce herself as a Black woman with Hispanic roots, even if she doesn't look that way or speak that way in a stereotypical sense. But her ethnic background is far more diverse and worth exploring, as one of the topics we discuss in our conversation. Which languages do you speak?
So the only language I really claim fluency in is English. Jamaica is an English-speaking country. A vernacular of English or nation language, Creole, Patois, if you want. I also am fluent in Jamaican Patois. So I would say those are the 2 where I can converse with no thought, no difficulty, no hesitation. Spanish is the other language. I would describe myself often as saying I have access to Spanish. With certainly I can read it with the aid of a dictionary. I know it well enough to do that. So if I meet a word I don't know, I'm fine looking it up. But in conversation, I love to say I have baby Spanish. I can say I want, I need, yo quiero, por favor. Like I can make myself understood in context, but I don't have the same level of access. So, and that has everything to do with migration. My mother's tongue is not my mother tongue. My mother her first language was Spanish. And when she moved to Jamaica and she moved with her mother, who was an English speaking native to an English speaking country, she stopped speaking Spanish at that age. So she often will say, she feels she got caught between the worlds of those two languages as a native speaker and then having to acquire a second language just before puberty for her. Yeah, that's my mom's story too, I guess.
So Shara McCallum's ethnic roots form a colorful mosaic of languages, dialects, and accents, which can be heard all over the Caribbean, especially in Jamaica. Jamaican Patois.
Patois.
A language like that, how much of it does it make into your poetry, into your writing?
Quite a lot. So the most recent book I've written, actually, I'm dealing with another language that I didn't mention, but it's not a language I can speak properly, but I can also read, which is Scots English. So Scots, its own language, similar to Patois, has a relationship to English. Many speakers of Scots alternate, like Jamaican speakers do, between Patois and Standard English, and kind of the range of languages are mixed together. So linguistically, this is why it's considered a Patois or a Creole, is that it's often spoken in tandem with the other sort of language that is one of its roots and one of its departure points, if you will. And I mention that because my interest is keen as a poet in vernacular languages, actually. And it didn't surprise me in a way that one of my connections to the book I've written was through Scots, the language itself, rather than also history. I'm deeply invested in and interested. Questions of race, identity, how history is visited on us in our lives as individuals, that I do not believe any of us stand outside of it. So I'm interested in those intersections, but language is a carrier for me for all of that, And I have one poem where I've actually written in Spanish as well. And it's similarly a poem that's in English with Spanish as well. And it's about my mother. And it's very much about the relationship that we experienced analogously as migrants that has gone on for some time in my family, the women in my family, I would say until my children did not come of age in the country that they were from. It's an interesting thing for 3 generations, going back to my grandmother. My daughters are the first to, I joked when my oldest daughter was about 8 or 9, I think we have to get up and leave now. If I'm following the family trajectory, time to leave, But in fact, they have come of age in the country they're from. So that's an answer about language. It's about also when you're from multiple worlds, and many Jamaicans really are, even those who do not migrate, are a product of violent histories that have come together, that the language carries that, I think. And also other things that aren't terrible. Humor, Jamaican humor is extraordinary. Its wit is phenomenal. And that kind of wordplay is often more prevalent in Patois than in English.
The mix of languages and cultures, as well as the corresponding music and melodies, have inspired Shara to write poetry. It is one of many fond memories she has of her childhood and of the sounds and songs she grew up with. What was your favorite children's song or nursery rhyme?
Oh, what a wonderful question. Yeah. So I have several, so many. I actually have credited my childhood and nursery rhymes songs music, various sources of language I heard all transmitted orally as tipping my ear in the direction of poetry. So I love your question. I'd say, for example, I don't know, this is not American, this is Jamaican. Knife and a fork and a bottle and a cork. That's the way you spell New York. You will appreciate this. Chicken in the car and the car can't go. That's the way you spell Chicago. I learned that as a child in Jamaica, had no idea what New York or Chicago were. So now I do, but I said that nursery rhyme with no understanding of it, right? Other than language. And it doesn't make sense. Knife and a fork and a bottle and a cork. That's the way you spell New York. Like, what does that mean? It's just sound play, right? Or British influences were also there in my nursery rhymes. So, Ring Around the Rosie. I sang that like a lot of children growing up. I had a lot of ring games I played like many Jamaican girls do. Certainly Brown Girl in the Ring, which is a Jamaican ring game. And then you'd have Ring Around the Rosie, which comes from the Black Plague in Europe. And you're singing these things as a small child with, ring around the rosy, and not like ashes, ashes, we all fall down. I don't remember one time as a small child thinking that meant death. So you're saying, I think poetry is that which we say ahead of our own understanding. And I think nursery rhymes, song, music, all of those sources of language that are wedded to each other in our earliest origins as people, they really are ahead of our understanding. There's something about it that, it contains that you fully experience over and over in different ways and different iterations, which is different than a lot of the ways we use language and understand language. It's supposed to communicate. It's supposed to be like an arrow. This equals this.
What has been the coolest sound you've heard recently?
The coolest sound, I suppose it's all over the place. I'm always hearing sound. So one of the things that I think is really interesting, that, again, to go back to Marta, she's been teaching me so much. Even the air conditioning behind me that I'm hearing, which I suppose it's strange to have air conditioning, maybe it's the heat that's coming on, that has a rhythm. And if you pay attention to it, you hear it. And I think that for me becomes interesting as a backdrop to this conversation. But yeah, I don't know, your voice, Marco, I'm really interested in people's voices too. So listening to you speak, I'm paying attention to what you're saying, but on some level, I'm also hearing the cadence of your speech, the pattern of your inflections. And I think that's interesting. So these are just two right now in the room with me. One through Zoom, one that's in the physical room I'm sitting in, that I'm thinking that's music too.
Shara McCallum and I keep wandering from topic to topic, exchanging stories and experiences, including the history of names like Chicago and Jamaica. In recent years, they have sort of rediscovered the real founder of Chicago, and he was actually from the Caribbean. He was French speaking, and he came originally from Haiti. And his name was Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. And if you had gone to Chicago, there would have been a little settlement, and they would greet you in the local Patois native language and in French Creole. In Patois, it is Chicago, and it means fields of stinky onions.
I love that. I really do. Yeah. Jamaica, by the way, the native inhabitants, the original inhabitants were Arawak. And Jamaica is a returning of closer to the Arawak word for the country. So it was first colonized by the Spanish and became Santiago in its name for the patron saint. And then when the English took over, they anglicized the Xaymaca is the spelling that would be reflective of the Arawak origins of language. And now it's Jamaica, Jamaica. Can't really spell when I'm in the air. Jamaica, which is the anglicized version of Jamaica, you know? And so I think that's also really interesting to think about with Chicago, what you're sharing, that, often only the European history is what we pay attention to still. And we don't think about the way in which language carries the trace, even of people who the European colonizers largely decimated through disease and force and enslavement in this part of the world that you and I are sitting in. But I think there's this desire increasingly, and I really love it, to talk about, especially the peoples whose land we're actually sitting on, who were the original inhabitants. So where I am, it's the Susquehannock. And you see a lot of the names of places that carry still that history. Yeah. So just another thread of language, circling back on this conversation about language. And even those histories that seem to be lost to us, there's often a trace of them.
Our discussion includes parts of the indigenous background of places like Chicago, Jamaica, and Pennsylvania. Shara McCallum knows a little bit about these things just because she's a keen observer of her surroundings, which comes in handy because she's also an essayist. As such, she frequently looks back at history and iconic names like Robert Burns, who has often been described as a great defender of democracy. But she has found out that his views on slavery stood in contradiction to the values generally attributed to him. What are you working on right now?
Well, the last thing I finished, and I'm going to start there, is this book, No Ruined Stone, which is an alternate speculative account of history. It imagines what would have happened had the 18th century Scottish poet Robert Burns migrated to Jamaica to work on a slave plantation, overseeing the work of enslaved Africans. This almost happened in the life of the real Burns, which surprises a lot of people to learn. If you know his work, that is why you might be surprised, because the work is so fiercely about the rights of man and very strong in its egalitarian beliefs that it extols the virtues of democracy. So that book took me a very long time to write. And right now, what I'm doing is I'm actually the Penn State laureate this year. So I'm going around and I'm reading from that book and I'm engaging people in conversation. So when we ask a writer, what is the work you're doing? We often mean, what are you writing? But I have found often in my life as a writer that there are periods of silence between books. And sometimes the reason for that is that I, as a poet who really believes in the oral tradition and also really wants to, even when I'm not a laureate, connect people to an art that has meant a lot to me and done a lot in my life for me. I go and I give readings, and that is a form of work I'm doing. Sometimes people look at it secondarily to the writing and think that's less than, or it's interrupting the writing. And of course, if you do too many of those or extend it too long, it can also prevent other things coming in. But for right now, my work is to be present in sharing in the way that orality shares language with others, in communion with other people in front of me. That's really my task right now for this year.
How do you create something out of nothing?
Well, in this case, a lot of times it's the reading. Yes, there's the repository of our experiences as humans that we carry. Memory is one of the ways we fashion it. The threads of images from the past or narratives. Even narrative is a construction each time. Storytelling, it's a selecting of details to create a narrative arc, right? So I think we carry that in us as people. So in a way, what you're waiting for is something to feel urgent. For me, the you I'm speaking of, for something to feel urgent enough for me to be compelled to speak. But the other input for me as a poet is other poetry, other language. And I find that just as important. And I think that's the difference for me between writing as an artist in a tradition and wanting to be engaging in that tradition versus sometimes people write solely for themselves. And that is not a dismissal of that activity. I think it is incredibly important. The capacity to express oneself that language gives us and poetry, even if indirectly gives us, is profoundly important. And I don't think writers ever get away from that. But it's that engagement with the work of the tradition that you are part of, I think, that defines for me the ongoing pursuit of a language and a way to access those subjective experiences I have and I carry in more and more distilled fashion.
How seriously do you take your voice when you're writing poetry?
For me, the voice, the quality of voice is hard to translate onto the page, but that's the goal. Yes. So ways that in life, people hear our voices, and you know this as a singer. I was a long time ago also interested in singing. I sang, I should say, interested in singing, and did other forms of art, performing art, dance, theater. I've spoken about this because I think it has shaped me distinctly as a poet. All of the gestures of the body that those performing arts rely upon, I am determined to get those into a poem which is fixed through language. And the only thing you have, diction and syntax. That's it. That's what you have to do that. And so I'm sort of fascinated by the way that I can wield syntax in a poem. The line, obviously, in poetry. In music, it's the measure, right? And it's in prose, it's the sentence. So if you think about this, I always think of music as analogous to poetry, by the way, constantly. When I teach students, I say, with music, you have everything is determined by the silence, actually. People think it's the notes that are sounded, but the silence between those notes, with the pauses, the rests, that's what allows you to not only hear those notes distilled, but also what becomes beat, rhythm. Also, when a singer is singing and we talk about somebody's, phrasing as a singer, we're talking about what they're doing, not just with notes, but with silence between those, right? So I love that with poetry, and I think I'm always trying to get that in. But when it comes to reading a poem, I rely on the more performative elements of the voice to also carry it. So they won't be mimetic, they can't be. And I will just say one last story because this relates to a recent work I've done, which has just been transformative for me. I worked with a composer a few years ago. Her name is Marta Gentilucci. She's Italian. And I happened to meet her when she was in residency at the Radcliffe Institute, which is at Harvard and Cambridge. I went up there to work with her. She took some of my poems along other poets, and she had discovered it as you did, Marco, through my voice. Marta is completely interested in the voice of the poet reading the poem as a form of music, not just the poem and the text. And I worked with her again recently to create a new piece that me and Marta worked on, and then 3 other poets worked with Marta. We all came together and worked with singers and performed this in the Biennale in Venice. So for me, this was such a gift of an experience as an artist to get to work with composers and singers and to be in that conversation where our voice as poets, the speaking voice of poetry was music. It's really, I don't know if that is too far afield from what you thought when you heard this, but that's where my mind goes with the kinship that's there between the spoken poem and music, and more than just the text.
Even today, does music play an important part in Shara's poetry? Recent projects of hers include collaborative work with musicians and composers to open up her poetry to new perspectives. Sometimes it is necessary to pause a little bit because it is like an attention getter in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And the pauses are what punctuate the sound, right? So I think it's true of performance And when I'm writing, I'm trying to use punctuation, syntax, and line to convey those pauses. Yeah.
But in the first place, poetry is a literary genre, which means that it can also be about telling stories. And as part of that picture, I give Shara a little task. It consists of 3 words rhyming with each other that I have dreamed about the night before. So, is there a story? And what would it be like? That's what I would like to know. Stargazer, dream chaser, trailblazer. How does the story go on from there?
I would say that the story for me, immediately those words conjure up a desert. So the first thought I have is the setting, not so much the narrative action, but where is that? And then from there, and that's likely just how my mind operates, setting the land for me is a character in every story and in every work. I think the land has the history. So I would first want to know where I am, and then I would want to know where in time I am. Because in order to form character, I think you need to know where the person is speaking and in what moment. And so I'm talking about maybe how I would build a story rather than saying where the story ought to go. It conjures immediately. I love the repetition and the rhyme. Gazer, it's gazer both times. Stargazer, dream gazer as well.
Stargazer, dream chaser, trailblazer.
Trailblazer, right. So it's just the last 2 syllables that are chiming each time. But for me, what I think of is, the stargazing, where is that so palpable? And I think the word trail is also what did it. So I think when I think of a desert, and especially in American contexts, the vastness of the North American continent is that there are these swatches of desert inside of, we're talking about the greenery of autumn, but America also encompasses desert. So I'm fascinated by the desert. It's not a place I'm from at all. I have only visited it, never lived there. So I'd be very interested if I were writing that to think about who is sitting there looking at the stars. And because I tend to think through women's points of view, though not always, I would probably ask, who is she? What has happened to her right before she's sitting there? What does she want? These kinds of questions are how I would move the story forward. Each of us has personal attachments to the same words. And following those attachments is, I think, one of the ways to hone your vision as a writer. Not necessarily repeating yourself, but paying attention to the patterns that your mind creates helps to push forward. When I think about visual artists a lot in this regard, and my favorite being Frida Kahlo. And I think what she's following is an obsession and her own set of associations of color, of shape, of image, and storytelling, autobiography. She's constantly looking at herself. And that might sound myopic, but in her world, that's what allows her access to moving outward. So that's what I think of when we're talking about stargazers, how differently you and I associate from that word, and everybody listening to us would also be able to do this and take themselves somewhere else.
In the course of my conversation with Shara McCallum, I throw in a few comments about all kinds of topics, using images to get her instant reaction. Well, we're not a melting pot at all, we are a salad, because every ingredient keeps its identity.
I think the melting pot analogy has fallen out of fashion even in the United States. I hear the salad analogy a lot more in the US now too. I think it was a momentary desire that has passed. But what I will say that is interesting to me is it seems always, I lived in Miami when I came to the United States, and that is actually where I learned the Spanish that I speak, not in my house, not from my Venezuelan mother. And I always point that out because I say to people who lived in that space, the insistence on not becoming bilingual when you are given such an opportunity to try is remarkably strange to me. I understand the desire that you have to be territorial about your language. I get it. I am not unaware of the politics of language. However, just on the level of being a person who loves language, if I had grown up in, Montreal, even if my first language was English, I cannot imagine, and I'm not, say, French Canadian, I can't imagine not wanting to learn French. Like, I don't, and I know it doesn't go that way. I know that because I understand the politics again of this. But this is a segue from your comment just to my own, that I wish that, and I wish people would be more embracing of opportunities that are in front of them, because I think that would also go a long way, not toward losing your identity, but expanding it.
How can you and your poetry save the world?
Ooh, that is a big job. I don't think anything or anyone can save the world, but I think that you could choose, and I hope to be someone who has chosen to do my part. And I think if each of us took on some of that responsibility, I think the world would be better. So rather than what happens often that I observe is people feeling they cannot save the world and therefore why bother, just live for myself, and or the world isn't my concern. There are all kinds of reasons people withdraw, but some of them are really because they're very empathetic and they're overwhelmed by their empathy. And I often try to say, especially to young people, I see it. But you have to still try. In what way can you do it? And so I don't have enough of a sense of what the effect of my life will be, and that's okay. What is the effect of my poetry? I just know that I have to use it to be as honest as I can about the experiences, not only that I've had, but that I've witnessed, that matter to me, to bring into my consciousness more fully. And therefore, I have to trust that other people, by having that, will either feel more seen in cases where history and literature have not actually represented people like me very much, and or the peoples I'm from very much, or if they have, not in a way that I'm very happy with. And I have to hope that that does something, for a reader. But the reality is, I think none of us really know the impact, but you still have to keep going and trying.
Shara McCallum is also a teacher, which is the reason why I also almost let her speak to students all over the world at some point during our discussion. And she loves to share bits and pieces of her own experiences with any virtual listeners or readers who might be out there. Which advice would you have for a student in your field?
That's beautiful. And the reason I asked you if English is the language you are writing in and hearing is because I have friends who are bilingual and who have to choose, who make this choice. And I've also been particularly fascinated. I don't know what her first language is, but I'm fascinated. Maybe you learn them simultaneously sometimes, but often people have a first language and then they acquire another or more than one. But I'm fascinated by writers who have chosen English who it is not their first language. And I don't know which this young person is, but what I would say is really advice from observing what they have done. What they're trying to do is they love English's rhythms, syntax, and diction. That's why they're writing in it. But as much as anything else, it's because of what they've read that they love. And so what's really interesting about, for example, Mihaela Moskaliuk is a Romanian poet who does this. Her first language is Romanian, but she comes to literature through American literature. So when she becomes a writer, which is in her 20s and 30s, she becomes a poet, she is being formed out of that experience of the literature that she loves and wanting to participate in that tradition. However, she's bringing all of her subjectivity and experiences, having grown up under Ceausescu's regime in Romania under communism. And that meeting point, I think, is extraordinary. So this is an analogy for this young person to think about. What do your accesses to these languages allow you to do when you are writing in the one that you're choosing? In other words, what are the cultural attachments of those other languages you have access to that you can even bring into, say, English, if that's the chosen language? And then reading should dictate this too.
When you are a writer, author, or poet, your daily routine doesn't systematically consist of sitting down at your desk and writing. It also includes a fair amount of interaction with other people and your general audience. Shara McCallum loves to travel and give talks about her publications and poetry. It's the kind of experience which opens new horizons for her, including a podcast she does on the local NPR station with the idea to allow the audience to discover poets from Pennsylvania. So, what are you up to now?
I'm now going to transition after you and I finish speaking, Modco. I have a few other appointments later this afternoon. But what I'll do before then is actually I am dabbling in radio myself right now as the laureate. I am recording 4-minute programs, episodes, where I'm featuring the work of Pennsylvania poets. It's on a local affiliate for NPR, for National Public Radio, and it's a local NPR affiliate station. So it airs on Mondays, and it's, as I said, airs twice on Mondays. It's a 4-minute clip where I introduce the poet, introduce their work, the poem I've chosen, and I read it. So very similar to what you asked me to do at the end, but my voice is the entirety of the show to bring forth the work of another poet to the listening audience. And anyone listening to this program can find it because the episodes are archived on the website as soon as they are aired. I don't know if NPR's app carries the show, but you can certainly find it by searching Poetry Moment on WPSU. That's the call station, is WPSU. And if it's not on your app, you can always go to the website. And I would love it if people did, because this is a program I'm desirous of bringing attention to other poets and having the work of poetry be part of people's daily life. You know, people listen to NPR when they're driving. I love that idea. That they're just not expecting a poem. It's between the news and the next segment. And here I come with, here's a poem for you to hear by a poet. And I also think that there is something very intimate about the experience of voice. It carries something of the body of the person, but so many of the other things that we're paying attention to are taken away. And I think it just we listen more carefully, you know.
Needless to say that I have prepared one of Shara McCallum's poems for her to perform at the end of our online conversation. It takes the reader on a journey through time to her childhood and is dedicated to her sisters. And her unique voice literally takes the reader by the hand to another place and another time.
I'm Shara McCallum, and the poem I'm going to read is The Art Room. It begins with a dedication for my sisters. Because we did not have threads of turquoise, silver, and gold, we could not sew a sun nor sky, and our hands became balls of fire, and our arms spread open like wings. Because we had no chalk or pastels, no toad, forest, or morning grass slats of paper. We had no color for creatures. So we squatted and sprang, squatted and sprang. 4 young girls, plats heavy on our backs. Our feet were beating drums, drawing rhythms from the floor. Our mouths became woodwinds. Our tongues touched teeth and were reeds.
If this poem was a question for you, what would be your answer?
The poem is a question for me. The answer is, out of ostensibly deprivation comes imagination.
Finally, Shara McCallum tells me about her fascination of faraway places like Peru, especially after she had looked up the information about the Alamundi International Cultural Center in Lima, Peru, to find out who she is going to speak with. If this was a job interview, what position would you like to apply for?
I want to go to Peru and work in the cultural center. That's what I want. So, or at least get to visit it if I can't work there, because it's hard when you have a job that is calling to you to take on another. But that's the first thought that pops into my head, is that Zoom is lovely, and here we are in Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania and Chicago, speaking to each other, and then the radio broadcast of this conversation means people from anywhere could hear it. But the attachment that I have is still so much to place that when you invited me to do this, the first thing that I did, Marco, I wasn't familiar with the center, was looked it up. And I wanted to know more about who I would be speaking with. I'm curious about people in that way. And that was, I'd love to go there and learn more about the center someday.
Any questions?
Yeah, I always have questions, a million questions. So without knowing who's in front of me, I think one of my most important questions to get to know a person is, why are you here?